Hi, everyone. My name is Elijah Gaddis, and I want to welcome everybody to this talk on behalf of the Auburn University History Department. This is the second in our Black History Speaker Series for this year. And our theme this year is a focus on race, inequality, and social justice in Alabama. We're really happy to be bringing these vitally important stories to light and to a broader audience. And we have some really wonderful talks that we're going to be announcing soon for next semester. But of course, we also have today two really wonderful speakers who are going to serve as the centerpiece of our fall speaker series. And I'm really delighted today to introduce and to welcome Ashley Brown and Olivia Nichols to talk about the Lee County Remembrance Project. So Ashley Brown is a doctoral candidate in the Counselor Education and Supervision program at Auburn. I hope that's right, at least it's close. She also has her MED from Auburn. She's been a graduate teaching assistant and instructor and is nationally a board certified counselor. Olivia Nichols is doctoral candidate in Human Development and Family Science, which it has, I think also, hopefully that's right, which has the fun acronym, of course, that we don't get in history department. She's been an instructor in HDFS, and in addition to her in-progress doctorate, she has an MS from Auburn, where she was an outstanding master's student in 2017. There are a million other things that I could say about both Olivia and Ashley, and just sort of add to the list of awards and work that they've done. But the thing that I really wanted to emphasize today in introducing them is that I think they are both exemplars of the model of scholarship that is engaged in community. And I think that they, and especially the work that they'll present today, represent the absolute best in the outreach mission of our university, of Auburn University. And they're really using the work of the Lee County Remembrance Project and their work more generally to insist on our responsibility to the communities that we live and work in. And in so doing, I think are serving as models of ethical scholarship for all of us. And so I'm so delighted to know them, and really pleased to introduce for you today Olivia Nichols and Ashley Brown. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gaddis, for that amazing introduction of Olivia and I. Thank you to the History Department at Auburn University for allowing us of this opportunity to really have more discussion, in-depth discussion about the 4 Black men who were lynched due to racial terror lynchings, and just really sitting with that and having more conversation and dialogue. So thank you all so much for your continued support. Olivia and I are the co-founders of the Lee County Remembrance Project, which is very much so a community-driven initiative where we have a partnership with the Equal Justice Initiative Center. And we are really working towards reconciling the racial terror that occurred here in Lee County, including violence and trauma experienced in the Black community. And so we are so honored to be in this mix and to be participating and to be co-founders and have so many folks who we just can't even name how many people have assisted us in this work to really focus on these 4 Black men and focusing on them and remembering them and commemorating them. We want to bring about the education. We want to tell these narratives. We want to tell these men's stories. We want to provide some humanity that was stripped from them. And so today we will go over some very detailed information about these lynchings, about these Black men's experiences. And so, although it may be very difficult for you to take in, for you to sit with, we encourage you to do so. We encourage you to stay with it as much as possible, because we have to have conversations and sometimes uncomfortable dialogue so that we can really understand the fullness of our history, in particular, the experiences of the Black community, the trauma that's there because of these racial terror lynchings and other traumatic experiences that have occurred in the Black community. We have to acknowledge that so we can move forward to a better tomorrow. Maya Angelou says it best: history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. So we're going to be courageous here, and we're going to go through a journey and have more conversation about these men. And I hope that, we hope, Olivia and I hope that you all are able to sit with it and consider what are some things that you may be able to do in moving forward. Now that you are equipped and knowledgeable about this history, how do you move forward in order to really dismantle systematic oppression and really face these injustices in the roles that you may have?
So I think it'll be helpful to start and just clarify what are lynchings. And these are mechanisms of racial control. They are violent public executions that were orchestrated by white mobs in attempt to regain and retain public, economic, and social superiority. These are characterized by white impunity and disregard for the legal system. So between 1877 and 1950, there's been over 4,000 documented lynchings that have occurred in the United States. And this number grossly underrepresents the number of individuals killed in the name of racial terror. It doesn't include homicides or race riots. And that only includes documented cases. There are likely many more that are not documented. But of these 4,000 and of the many more, only 1% of those involved in the lynch mob were ever held accountable. And lynchings first emerged as a form of vigilante retribution, this idea of enforcing popular justice, especially on the Western frontier. But around the 1930s, lynchings became more and more lethal, and the South employed to defend slavery, particularly around a suspicion of a slave rebellion. And after the Civil War, lynchings became further radicalized and again intended to reestablish white supremacy through racial violence and suppress Black civil rights. So we like this quote a lot, and we've been using it more and more because there's something really hard to get at about lynchings that really encapsulates the fullness of the community effect. And so I'll read it quick. So the active ingredient in a lynching is silence. Like all forms of theater, a lynching depends on what is left unsaid. It creates a mood, an atmosphere. The silence that settles in after the euphoric act of violence, which all have witnessed, tells a minority group that it has been forsaken. It is this element of a suggestive and creeping threat in which the state apparatus and a silent majority are complicit that has the power to demoralize a community as much as the physical acts of violence. So we're really happy to be here today to be breaking this historical silence and current silence that surrounds these lynchings and confronting them head on. And as we go through, like Ashley mentioned, we'll go through each case and then we'll wrap up at the end with what can we do now. I'm going to start going through John Moss and George Hart, and Ashley will continue with Charles Humphreys and Samuel Harris to tell their stories. But to quickly note, in this research, we found over 500 articles on these cases. Newspapers that spread across the nation, not just concentrated in Alabama or in the South. But unfortunately, this is our primary source of information, which is pretty problematic, right? To know what actually happened. At this time, journalism was dominated by white journalists and embedded in a culture of white supremacy. So the narratives that were told actively dehumanized each of these men and their families, often claiming they were dangerous or guilty, while ascribing those that took part in murders and lynch mobs to be strong or masculine. Writers often took part in the lynch mobs or were sympathetic to them. So we really want to make that point clear. You can see that in the quote here by I.W. Wells: "Those who commit the murders write the reports." So in all, we're left with these articles as primary sources because of the silencing that was done to Black families and to Black community members, and the impunity that was granted to those that committed these murders and then wrote the reports about the murders. So to start with, John Moss and George Hart were between the ages of 18 and 22, and they were farmhands for the Waldrop family just outside of Waverly, Alabama. And if you've been to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, you may notice that John Moss was actually switched, and it was John Hart on the memorial column. And that's because we start to see towards the later half of the articles, there was the switch. John Moss's name was replaced with John Hart. And this is, again, very much an indifference to Black humanity, and even just getting the name right in these articles. So we've been working with EJI, and we are pretty confident that his name was actually John Moss. So we will use that, but you might see in the articles him referred to as John Hart. So this story begins around October 28th, when Ed Waldrop Jr. was found dead in one of the Waldrop fields. A search party was let out and had found him there. And we later learned in the articles that John Moss was the first that had found the body. You can read this quote here. John Hart was the first to report where the body had been found and where it was. Suspicion at once rested upon the Negro. That's from the Montgomery Advertiser. After this occurred, elaborate stories became garnered that involved a trade deal and a potential robbery. Story changes throughout the articles. But regardless, both John and George fled the area. John Moss had fled towards Wetumpka, Alabama, where he was there captured and denied accusations and any involvement in this murder. And you can read here in this newspaper article, when he was taken back to Waverly area, he was held in Canaan Church, and he was held there with the guard. But that evening, a party of masked men, so you can see a numbering about 50, broke open a church, which is Canaan Church, and they took John Moss from the guards, where they had taken him, tortured him, and hanged him. You can see after which they riddled his body with bullets, as the article states, and after which they had burned it. And then the Montgomery Advertiser written on the 4th, 2 days before this, knew this was going to happen. You can see in this quote here, an article that was published a few days earlier. It says, Charlie Waldrop, a brother of the murdered young man, and several other men told me before I left the neighborhood that they would kill the Negro by shooting, hanging, or burning him, that they were determined to end a life, to put an end to his miserable life by sunrise. Yet nothing was done to protect him. After this, fear and anger deepened in Waverly. You can see in some of these articles, it's a bad state of affair. People were arming themselves, and rumors festered about an organized robbery and murder on an extensive scale. So much so that other citizens were arrested and charged under a murderous conspiracy. 2 residents, Anthony Williamson and Carrie Trammell, were held on bond You can see for $1,000 and $300, which equates to more than $27,000 and $8,200 today. And they were arrested. Their bonds were paid by a man named Mr. Barlow, who operated a farm of labor, of leased convicts in Tallapoosa County. He paid their bonds as a means to put them to work on their farm, holding them in a state-sanctioned status of unpaid labor. And this is operating through this loophole, both created by the 13th Amendment, but even another loophole in which they weren't even convicted. He's paying their bonds and reinstating a state of slavery. So 2 days after this happens, George Hart is captured by a different Trammell in Birmingham and taken to Montgomery. And this is because there was such a high threat of violence and armed mobs forming in Lee County. He was transitioned to the Lee County Jail on November 1st, preparing for a trial date in 2 weeks. And this was actually attempted 2 prior times, but again, due to the threat of violence, he was taken back to Montgomery. But on this 3rd attempt to transition to Lee County Jail, he had stayed overnight. And on the 5th, when the news broke that he was in the Lee County Jail and projected to be cleared of all charges, there wasn't going to be enough evidence. A mob of over 60 armed men broke into the jail and kidnapped George Hart from the sheriff who was there on this very day 133 years ago. He was then taken back to Waverly, the same spot in which they had lynched John Moss. And you can read here later in the article. It's a very long article published on the first page of the paper on Montgomery Advertiser. And it says, certain men who knew the facts in the case felt indignant at the prospect of the prisoner's escape from the death sentence. So they determined to take the law in their own hands and see if the punishment meted to him was swift and sure and terrible. And so it was. And not only did they murder George Hart, but a note was left, a placard was left on his back. And it read, here you can see reported in Eufaula, said this Negro was hung by 100 determined men. Whoever cuts him down will receive his fate. In the Opelika newspaper article, The Times, you can see the note changes here. And they report, it says, the man that cuts this Negro down will swing from the same limb. He was put there by 100 men. Negroes who act right will certainly be treated right, but when they get out of their place, they will swing to this tree. George Hart was also shot 3 times. In his side pocket, they found pictures of what we think is President Cleveland, Mrs. Cleveland. In his coat pocket was a small testament, a letter from his wife, bearing the postmark of Nova Sola. So this article is then released a few days later. And a special grand jury had been impaneled to investigate who and which took part in this lynching of George Hart. And after a few days, you can see that we respectfully report, after a due and diligent inquiry of a number of witnesses summoned by our order, they are unable to elicit anything concerning or implicating the person or persons involved, and they remain to us unknown. This is despite we've been able to recognize at least 7 names in newspaper articles, right? So we have a pretty good sense of who took part in it, and this reflects a general alliance with the legal system in protecting the white citizens who engage in violence. And we had presented this last year at Greater Peace Baptist Church. And that morning before our presentation, it was 5 years after Eric Garner was killed, this verdict here was announced that the federal civil rights charges against Officer Pantaleo would be dropped. And we shared this slide, and we continue to share it because we've refused to keep doing this with more cases. Because there was something so familiar about the reason why there would be no charges. And you can see from the report from the New York Times here. They report how prosecutors did a rigorous analysis of the event, but in the end, they believe they did not have enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Officer Pantaleo committed a crime. So whether it's enough evidence to say who was involved or enough evidence to see if they've committed a crime, despite number of names listed, despite video footage, this theme of white impunity seems to continue and continue and continue to occur. So it's familiar. It's not just unjust, and it's familiar. Hopefully by raising these stories and knowing the power of this history, the power of language, we know what this reflects. We know what it means, and we can choose to confront it and to change it.
Now we will be talking about Charles Humphreys. Charles Humphreys, on March 17, 1900, was accused of attempted assault on a white girl. And it is very important to consider the newspaper reports. That's different things. So as Olivia said earlier, the newspaper's sources are ones that we have to better understand the accounts and the narratives, because the Black perspective, unfortunately, we don't have, because these individuals were lynched. So we hope that you're looking at these newspaper sources or articles that are before you with a critical eye. But going back to Charles Humphreys, newspaper reports stated something different. Some reported him being in her bedroom when she entered, while others reported him sneaking into her bedroom while she was asleep. On March 18th, 1900, the McCoy men of this young white woman, as you see in the article, the family members kept up the hunt for the Black fiend all night long before shooting him over 40 times the next morning at Humphreys' home in Phoenix City. Olivia and I have lots of questions about Charles Humphreys. Not only do we have little information about this account and about the fullness of what the experience may be, but we really question, how old was Charles Humphreys? And so when you look at the different newspaper clippings before you, there's some articles that say he was 22 years of age, while another, if you see circled, says that he was young. We believe that Charles Humphreys was a teenager, and could have been possibly maybe no older than 16 or younger. We wanted you to take a look at the age, because this is something that we see still present day about the ages of Black young boys and how they're reflected in newspapers as being young men. That makes a difference in the crime. That has different consequences in terms of our legal system. But just wanted you all to reflect on this, because this is still being done even with Black women or young Black girls. Their ages, they're looked at as sometimes being way older than what they really were. And so we also see the thing about ages in other cases as well. Now, what's interesting here is that for Miss Nettie McCoy, she was classified as being in one article 16 years old, while in another 13. So we see her age going down as Charles Humphreys was going up. And so we have thoughts about why this may be. And one major thought is that it makes this accusation more heinous because it gives an appearance of an older man, grown man, entering or being there in this young white girl's room. Next, we have Samuel Harris, who was a farmhand on the George Meadows farm near Salem, Alabama. And on November 3rd, 1902, Mrs. Virginia Meadows and her daughter, Catherine Meadows, were struck in the head with an axe during what was called an attempted robbery and murder. Now, this case of Samuel Harris is very interesting for a number of reasons. And so we will get to and make some of those points very soon. On November 3rd, 1902, that afternoon, Samuel Harris was brought to Catherine to determine his guilt. The only evidence that was provided was that there was smut on his face and on his fingers. And so that may have been taken from the back of the Meadows chimney or used perhaps in an attempt to hide his face. He was shot to death by over 125 white men. I want you to notice in this article that's before you, it says one victim will die. That's very important for you all to consider as we move forward. It is very interesting that it was determined that one person would die. And neither Virginia Meadows nor Catherine Meadows died. Also, even in this attempted robbery, there was nothing taken. And so those are things to consider as well. It continues to get even more interesting because the wife of Samuel Harris and his father-in-law then were involved. And they were seen as accomplices to this crime. And their names were Beatrice and we have Monroe Dawkins. I want to pause and say this is not uncommon to see. Oftentimes the entire family sometimes were brought in or different accusations were made. And so this isn't an uncommon thing to see. However, I want you all to reflect upon the trauma here. So Beatrice just experienced her husband being lynched and is being accused of being an accomplice of this crime along with her father. And so there was no evidence, no reason for, as from what we can see, for Beatrice nor Monroe to be seen or thought about as accomplices. What we do know about Monroe Dawkins is that he was seen as a prominent or respectful citizen, and it reads of this county, and it reads that he has been a good Negro, peaceable, law-abiding, and of good deportment from the Montgomery Advertiser. We think that they may have spoken up. We think that they were trying to be advocates for Samuel Harris. And by so doing, they ended up being accused of being accomplices for this crime. Samuel Harris was born in February of 1878. He married Beatrice Harris, and they had 2 children. And at that time, those 2 children, Annie Harris was 3, and Mark Harris would have been 2. And Beatrice, at the time of Samuel Harris's lynching, was pregnant with their 3rd child, whose name was Samuel Harris Jr. Just want us to take a second and just pause and reflect on the whole family. And I think this particular lynching that's discussed really highlights the family and how the family was involved. I think it highlights Black women and experiences that Black women went through, having to raise and continue a family with facing such a traumatic experience as such as a racial terror lynching of your husband, the father to your children. And so you're forced to continue to move and navigate and go forward. But how difficult that had to be for her, for the entire family, for the community at large, those who knew him, those who knew all of these men, what those experiences may be for them, and how that lives on even within those families present day.
So we wanted to talk about just one of the legacies of lynchings that we've been learning more about, and that is this presumption of guilt and dangerousness. And the white narratives used to justify lynchings did so by reinforcing the belief that Black citizens were dangerous and posed a threat to white citizens. And we haven't dealt with this. We haven't reckoned with it. And our inability to address these false narratives has allowed it to continue in a multitude of ways. And we've been learning about it, especially more in the legal system. This quote that's often used, a Supreme Court case, Bragg in Georgia. And it says, perhaps the most important reason that lynching declined is that it was replaced by a more palatable form of violence. And while it's really interesting to think about, it's also very true that violence, racial violence, was happening in the legal system during the same time. There wasn't as if the legal system was some kind of a safe space. It's only if people could get to that legal avenue, right? We knew that in 1910, the incarceration rate for Black men was the 6th highest in the state here in Lee County. And even more so, we know that overall, being sentenced to death rather than lynch did very little to increase the fairness of the trial, reliability of the conviction, or justness of the sentence. So we've been learning more about some of the legal executions that occurred here in Lee County, especially these 3 men, Pomp Dickerson, Charles Sparks, and John Johnson. And we're not going to get too into it, so we have enough time at the end to discuss some of what we're doing and get the questions. But if you look at even just some of these titles, you can see how similar it is to how in which some of the lynchings were discussed and shared in these articles. And these accusations mirror those that were accusations for lynchings or different narratives used to justify a lynching. So instead of going through and being conducted by a white lynch mob, this was done through a jury. And these are public executions. They took place in the Opelika Courthouse jailhouse, which was the courthouse square area. People would even come and sit on the rooftops to watch these events. So I think it's really important to learn more about how during the same period, these systems were operating not as separate, but together as mechanisms of racial control and white supremacy. In one case that we've been interested in, and I think really begins to show this connection, is of Zealous Mizell. This mirrors the case of Charles Humphreys. and shows that this doesn't only apply to legal executions, but also to legal processes, including incarceration. So Zealous Mazel was around the age of 16, and he was accused of attempting to assault a white woman. Again, very loose, no information, very similar to Charles Humphreys. But his case went through a trial. But, as you can see in this article, this trial and sentence and the time spent here only consumed 40 minutes. So it's hard to even say that it went through a trial in any case. And you can see he was sentenced to 20 years. 20 years of life lost, but luckily he was released early after 11 years. So you can argue, sure, that's better, but that's not fair. That's 11 years of life lost. That's not a just system that takes 40 minutes under an accusation. So getting at these legacies is really important, and Ashley will share more here too.
So it is important to consider the racial difference of today. That although for African Americans or Black individuals, they're approximately 13% of the nation's population, 27% constitutes of all arrests, 33% of those incarcerated in jails and prisons, 42% of the population on death row, arrested at rates of 2.5 times higher than whites, 1 in every 3 Black boys are likely to be incarcerated in their lifetime. And I hope that we sit with those numbers and consider those percentages and just how traumatic those experiences may be, not just for the individual experiencing these things, but also for the family who is there to try and support as much as possible these men. And like lynchings, police brutality is also characterized by white impunity. I think that's really important to bring up and very important for us to consider. So you may at this point be thinking, what can I do? What are some different things that I may be able to do after hearing more about the experiences of these 4 Black men who were lynched due to racial terror, and other folks who are other men who have experienced racial injustices? And so to answer that question, we really encourage education. We encourage, now that you have an understanding of these stories, that you share those stories, that you learn more about these stories, that you get involved with Lee County Remembrance Project or even other organizations that really reflect upon and support racial reconciliation efforts. We also hope that you ask yourself the question of, what were you taught in your United States history courses? And who and what was it centered around? And once you answer those questions, we hope that then you explore, who were the voices that were left out? Who were the people who were excluded? And we hope that once you answer those things, that you will do what you can in your role to bring awareness, to bring knowledge about marginalized populations and experiences that have occurred in our history.
And we also hope that you continue to question why there are these large racial disparities in these very compounding in different systems. Question that and begin to learn from this history and look at what we've dealt with and what we continue to just experience and accept, because it's unacceptable. And you learn more about the landscape around you. Think about our memory of history. Who are we honoring through these different street names, these buildings, and these parks that are being named after? And is it who you want to honor?
And in terms of spatial justice, are all welcomed. So when you see these different buildings, these different parks named after folks, is it inclusive? Is it something that is welcoming to everyone, a space that's welcoming to everyone? And Olivia and I would question that, and we would say no. In terms of education, because that's such a emphasis that we place, especially as we continue to tell the stories of these 4 Black men, to educate about the stories, but also educate about just racial injustices experienced both historically and even present day. And so a continuation of that is that we have a partnership with your department, Auburn University History Department, as well as Pebble Hill. And we were awarded a small grant through the AU Concessions Board so that we could create a booklet that would bring this awareness and knowledge to the forefront and could be disseminated in the community to really speak to these racial terror lynchings, to speak to the vigilante racial violence experience, the justice system, and really to focus on telling the stories of the Black or African American individuals in Lee County, because that is something that we don't see. And that is so important to better understand what those individual stories are and continue to be, and not just those who are maybe descendants, but the entire community as a whole. The trauma is there and the experience is there for the entire community.
Another piece that we're working towards is commemoration. So again, thinking about this spatial justice and living memory of our history. So we've been working with folks all around Lee County to put together a historical marker. This is a rendered image that we have here of where we'd like to place the historical marker that publicly acknowledges these 4 racial terror lynchings that occurred here in Lee County. And so we've been working with the sheriff department, with numerous churches, with numerous entities around Lee County, the new chapter of the Lee County branch of the NAACP, all kinds of folks, to begin to figure out how can we memorialize this, how can we confront it publicly so we can heal from it. So we would encourage you to think about this and sign. We have a letter of support. If you're interested in signing it, you can go to our website and sign that letter. Encourage folks you know to sign a letter and just begin to acknowledge this history and confronting this reality and having that nice juxtaposition with the Lee County Courthouse, I think, is really powerful. And this goes hand in hand with what Ashley's getting at, spatial justice too, because this doesn't exist here in Lee County, right? But we do see so many other signs that tell us about our history in a very problematic way. So this is a map timeline, really, of Lee County here that begins to look at different monuments and schools that reflect the Confederacy. So if you look at, these are all different Confederate monuments. Red is at any site, and blue is on monuments on courthouse grounds. Green are schools named after Confederate generals, officers, white supremacists in general. So you can see we follow this timeline closely. In 1886, right after Civil War, Lee County was formed. We're named after Confederate General Robert E. Lee. And in this very year, 5 counties were actually created in Alabama, 4 of which were named after Confederate officers. We are just one of those. And there are numerous Lee counties around the country, not just in this specific Alabama region. There are 8 counties around the South named after Robert E. Lee. And then you can see with this large rise in Confederate monuments during the founding of the NAACP, we are here right in this. This is the Opelika Confederate Monument erected by the UDC on a small triangular plot right near the First Baptist Church in Opelika, very close to the courthouse grounds where we're looking to place this marker and begin to talk about this and confront this history. And it's even more clear the rise in Confederacy iconography memorials after Brown v. Board. You can see the retaliation that begins to occur due to desegregation calls. In 1965, Lee Academy opens in Auburn in direct response to desegregation. So we have a lot to reckon with here in Lee County, and hopefully this project and this attempt will just be one way to begin to reflect and talk about this and say we're not okay with how we understand this history and who we honor, and continuing to just live in these legacies instead of confronting them and finding somewhere new.
So we hope that you will continue this journey with us and you commemorate these men with us tonight. And so we will have our soil collection ceremony that will be held at 6:30 to 8 p.m. It will be done so virtually. And so what this ceremony is going to do is allow for commemoration, allow for reflection, but really consider the fullness of the narratives that we share before you today of these Black men who experienced racial terror lynchings. And so the soul really captures the blood, the sweat, and the tears that were experienced at that site during that time for those men. So we did a pre-soil collection where we collected this soil. And then tonight we want to join more in a larger ceremony with you all to really commemorate and fill these jars, but talk about these men's stories. It's a moment of reflection. It's a time of acknowledgement. And it's a time of discussing healing. What could that look like? What that may look like? So we hope that it brings forth a lot of dialogue, and we hope to see you. And please join us online by visiting our website that's listed below. Going to www.leecounty.remembrance.org and then join us there.
Yeah, well, thank you guys so much. We hope we have enough time for questions now, if there are any. And we're just really grateful to be able to discuss this whenever we get a chance to. It's really meaningful. And we hope that you will consider joining different ways and getting a part of it, learning your own stories, bringing and raising up more stories, just so we can know the truth. We have to know the truth and the reality to change the reality, right? And I think that's imperative today as well. So much of what we're seeing, we need to get to the truth and to confront our reality.
Thank you so much, Ashley and Olivia. That was, I know everyone else out there feels how powerful that was too. A hard thing to convey over the screen, but I know I speak for everybody when I say we're deeply appreciative of all sharing the story and the work that you've done for the past years now. I know this has been. We've got time for a few questions, and so please, folks, chime in the comments. We have one question to start from Steve Murray, who says, can you say a bit more about the challenges you faced in finding records related to these lynchings, and what were some of the greatest barriers?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can start, and then Ash, please add whenever you think more to it. But I think the greatest barriers is just how hidden so much information is and trying to compile it all and understand it. So with newspapers.com, it's really easy, right, to pull up a bunch of articles and see everything, but then it's taking it and trying to put it all together. Things don't match. They don't make sense. They're really spread so thin. And so using that information is helpful, but it's just often confusing as well. And so that was a big challenge. Then, of course, just the missing records, like the missing information. We can take that information and try to poke holes in it, try to think about what really happened. But again, we're missing, and we've searched through trying to locate different African American newspapers and different ways in which we can get more of it. But we're stuck with a side of a story, a really flawed side of a story.
I would say all of those things, Olivia, in addition to just going through these articles personally and our experiences, is very difficult to read these articles because we had to go into a deeper exploration so that we could not only just understand the fullness of these narratives, but so that we could convey it in a way that continuously honors these men, right? And so it was very difficult to sit there and read what those men's experiences were and how individuals treated them and how there was no humanity. And so there were some difficulties there that we both had. And we had to just process that with one another so that we can continue to move and do this work. I think sometimes people forget or don't consider, rather, how difficult it is to really explore and to tap into the fullness of racial injustices. Mm-hmm. When you start to get to the nitty gritty and understand these experiences, it is very difficult to sit with.
I have what I think is a sort of related question. I was struck throughout this, as someone who does a lot of this research myself, I was struck throughout this about the different sort of approaches that y'all take to this, right? As people who are trained in different fields, and I guess I wondered if you could speak a little bit from both of your kind of professional and scholarly backgrounds about advice or thoughts you have for historians who are writing about racial violence or writing about the trauma of the past, and what can we do? How can we adopt some of the tools and approaches that y'all have so productively and profoundly brought to this research?
Oh, that's so nice.
we do this every time with one another. Yes. I can start, and please add a little. So I would say with the counseling background that I bring, I really look at the trauma and the experiences and the fullness of those stories. And I think one thing or a few things that historians could consider when writing about this information is the trauma. Going beyond just like the stories, going beyond the newspaper articles that we've discussed, but really tapping and exploring into how traumatic these experiences were and how they continue to be. And so that comes out in different ways for folks. So it's not uncommon to see people be desensitized. It's not uncommon to see people get angry. It's not uncommon to see tears, in having these conversations and discussions right? So these are not uncommon things. So just considering that and considering people's the emotional toll that it can take on folks. And so really bringing that forward as well in telling the story, because I think it also gets to when we see mistrust, in particular in looking at the Black or African American community, mistrust of doctors, mistrust of police and other individuals. There's a history there. There's a reason for that. And so really exploring that and showcasing that.
And I think that's so critical when you're taking history and bringing it into the community, right? So I think that's such a superpower that Ashley brings, right? Because it's taking it and moving forward with it instead of just documenting it. And it is really interesting that we're doing this, and neither of us are history majors or degrees in any sense. So it's kind of funny. But I take a very systems approach. In human development and family studies, I look at health equity mostly. And so trying to understand both developmental implications of this, but also the various systems that allowed this to occur and the effects on neighborhoods, the effects on opportunities for health, just the way in which this was used as a mechanism of white supremacy to maintain segregation, to reduce access to civil rights and to well-being. I think we often don't talk about the violence, and we try to just talk about it as segregation was bad and it was not good for health. But there was heavy violence that was a huge part of this that we should be talking more about.
I know we're running low on time, but I want to ask a couple of these more great questions that are coming in from folks. From Ken No, thanks you, I think, as we all do, for this important research, and asked if there are descendants of these men still in the area, and if they have memories of or commemorate these men and their murders.
Yeah, we kind of two answers to that. We do think there are descendants in this area, and we have been trying to work with them, but we haven't actually found anyone that knew about this history yet. Everyone we've talked to has been surprised, not surprising that it happened, but to learn the individual stories. And so we're hopeful they'll be able to work more closely with descendants. There's also been difficulties, and this goes back to the record question, is that there isn't enough census information, that they weren't documented. There wasn't any documentation of these families that we can then trace to assist in identifying descendants. So that's another one of our big struggles, especially with very common names like Harris and Humphreys.
Right. I would say, to add to that, we're doing what we can to explore, because it's very important that we do reach out to descendants, and that we have more dialogue in a process, right? Because it's going to take a journey. It's going to be a journey, sometimes, to discuss that lynching and discuss the fullness of its occurrence, but also understanding the family and where they may be now. That has to be considered. And so it's such a emotional journey, a traumatic journey. And so we're trying our best to find those individuals, to reach out and have more dialogue if they're willing.
And even there's still some landscape elements, if you look down near Salem and Smith Station, Meadows Crossroads is still there, and that's the residue of the Meadows plantation. They still own a lot of that property, and there's still a cotton field where Samuel Harris was pulled from when he was lynched that still exists. And so we see that in our living landscape as well.
Yeah, that really profound reflection on how proximate we are to these things, not just geographically, but temporally. One more question from Melissa Blair that I'd love for y'all to think about. Do you think the misnaming of John Moss was a deliberate attempt to make the two men seem related? Is that maybe part of what's happening here?
Yeah, that could be. One thing we think is almost kind of the opposite too, in that because some reports that they were cousins, some said brothers, we think cousins. It was almost more convenient to just say John and George Hart to kind of collapse across the two. But it could have been made make that even easier, to make it more clear that they were in fact related, to get to your point. So yeah, I think it's a little bit of both of that and just a general indifference. Yeah.
Anything to add, actually? Okay, good. I just want to make sure. Hard to catch cues.
I know.
It's so hard.
Well, I'm going to end it there because I know y'all have a very busy afternoon. Maven has put, or Pebble Hill have put in the person behind the scenes, Maven, putting lots of links, I know, in the chat to go check out Lee County Remembrance Project's website, to sign the letter that they're telling us about, and especially tonight to have the really the sort of honor and privilege, if you haven't been to a soil collection ceremony, to go to one of those. It's an incredibly moving experience, and one I think that you'll not want to miss. And I think, am I correct in thinking that we are commemorating an anniversary today? Which some of you certainly noticed as we were presenting. It is November the 5th. An easy thing, I think, to forget. So thanks again so much, Ashley and Olivia, for doing this. We're deeply, deeply appreciative, and I know we all learned a lot and have a lot to reflect on from here today. So thanks again, and thanks everybody for joining us today, and for Maven and Pebble Hill for helping us put this on. So appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you all so